All right, we're going to talk about some directional terms and body regional terms, which are important in understanding positioning for things like radiographs, or if someone asks you to restrain an animal in a certain position, you'll need to know these terms. So we're going to discuss them in relation to pretty much any four-legged animal. We're going to stick with the quadrupeds or four-legged animals. And here you see a picture of a cat, and the red line down the center here is depicting what's called the midline. And frequently we will use a part or a position, a landmark on the animal to compare something to. So this particular picture, I believe, is set up to describe a term called medial, which means towards the midline. So you see this arrow which is headed towards the midline. And medial has a partner. Many of these terms have kind of an opposite term. The opposite would be away from the midline or lateral. So you will see these terms. We'll see them later on in this discussion. And that's the first two to get us started. I'm going to pause here and let you watch a short video which describes some of these terms on a dog, and then I will come back and go through them with you.
Hi, I'm Megan. Today we're going to go over some directional terms. These are terms that are going to be used when you're taking radiographs or when you're describing where a wound is, so it's important that you know them, understand them, and use them in your everyday vocabulary. So we'll start with the easy ones, dorsal and ventral. Dorsal is kind of along the spine, this side of the dog, and I like to think of it like a dorsal fin on a shark. And ventral is the abdominal side, so dorsal, ventral. We also have cranial and caudal. So cranial is towards the head, caudal is towards the tail. So if you're describing a mass that's kind of along the spine, you can say it's caudal or cranial, depending on which direction you're thinking. We also have dorsal and palmar. So when you're talking about radiographs on the limbs, this is the dorsal side on the top here, and palmar is underneath. So think of your own palm. So dorsal, palmar. Come over here. We also have distal and proximal. Distal is farther away from the body. So this is the distal end of this leg. Proximal is closer. So we're proximal. You can be distal to the stifle, proximal to the stifle. We also have medial and lateral. Medial is closer to the center. So when we have this dog laying on her side, we can have the medial, which would be the inside, or the lateral, which is the outside here. So when we have the saphenous veins, this is the lateral saphenous. The medial saphenous is going to be on the inside here. Then we have rostral, which is towards the nose. So if you're, say you're taking a radiograph of the head and the doctor says we need to get more rostral, then you know you need to get more of the nose in. And that's it.
So here is a picture of a horse, obviously, with all kinds of terms denoted on this picture. This horse is, the view of this horse is what we would call a lateral view, meaning we are standing from the side or lateral to the horse away from the midline, and we are looking at the horse. And many pictures that you will see in your book will be either a lateral view like this, or if the horse was turned around, so we were looking face to face at him, that would be an anterior or cranial view, because cranial is a term, as you see right here, which means toward the head. So if we were in front of the horse toward their head end and looking at them, we call that a cranial view. Versus if we were looking at the horse from behind, if we were standing back here and looking at this horse, we would call this a caudal view if we were looking at the tail. So that starts there. That gives us two of the terms, cranial and caudal. Caudal meaning towards the tail, cranial meaning towards the head. When we get to the head, there are some, so within the head itself, there is a special term for, because the head, towards the head is cranial. So once we get to the head, we have a different term, which means going away from the tail, and that is rostral. So as we go down in the direction of that arrow, or towards the nose is really what it means, we term that direction rostral. The back of the animal, as she described in the video, is dorsal. So like, remember a little dorsal fin, you could think of it on a porpoise or dolphin. Ventrals towards the belly here. And when you're on the legs, we have what's referred to as the dorsal surface, which is really the front of the limb, and then the plantar or palmar. So I believe she used the term palmar surface is the back of the limb, or you can think of the palm of your hand like being the bottom or the back of the horse's hoof. Proximal and distal, she also talked about these. This is a pair of terms that is used on limbs. So closer to the body connection is proximal and further away is distal. We have some body terms here which would be the same whether it was horse, dog, cat, whatever. So right here, this joint is called the carpus, which is analogous to, in a human, the wrist joint. Now, horses' legs are set up very differently from humans' arms. So the wrist joint is actually way up here in what is commonly called the knee, but it really isn't a knee. We're going to stick with this term called the carpus to be clear on that. It's not written here, but just for those of you who are interested in horses, down here is our fetlock, which is sort of between, or it's the next joint down from the carpus. And then we have between the hoof and the fetlock is the pastern. So just a couple more terms for horse limbs. Let's see. I think that's pretty much all I'm going to say on that particular picture. And here's a cat with similar terminology. We've got our rostral and caudal. We've got, so rostral, remember, towards the nose, caudal towards the tail, so anywhere towards the tail. If we're beyond the head, however, we use cranial for towards the head. Dorsal is the back, ventral is the belly. And the kitty, the carpus, is right here. So kind of the analogous joint to what we were just looking at in the horse. And here you see those terms dorsal and palmar. In this picture, they use plantar for the rear leg. That's fine. Palmar, plantar, pretty much for our purposes. So we're going to say they're pretty much the same. It just means the bottom surface of the foot, basically. Okay, I think that's all that we need to look at on Kitty. Here's a cranial view. So remember, cranial means we're in front of the animal or on the cranial end of the animal, the head end, and looking at them from the front. We can still use these terms, distal and proximal, as you see here on the limb. So distal is away from the connection, proximal is toward the connection to the body. We have in this guy, like we had in that very first slide, that in the kitty, we have the medial plane, or a line drawn right down the center of the animal. And if we are moving more towards the center line, we call that medial, or away from it, lateral. So if we were talking about surfaces on this limb right here, this would be the medial surface. And over here would be the lateral surface, so away from the midline. When we talk about right and left in animals and describing them, it's always their right and left, not our right and left as we are looking at them. There's also a term here called the sagittal plane, and median plane. A plane is describing, like if you took a piece of plexiglass and sliced directly through the animal, how would you separate that animal into two pieces? So the sagittal plane would separate the animal into a right and a left piece. If you go exactly down the middle or midline of that animal, we call it the median plane or median sagittal plane, because it is a sagittal plane. Sagittal planes always divide into a right and a left portion. But you could have a sagittal plane anywhere along this animal and still make a right and a left piece, so to speak. So here's a lion demonstrating the same thing with the median sagittal labeled M and the S labeled just S for sagittal. Here's a posterior view of a donkey, And again, we've got the median plane and a sagittal plane outlined with the black lines. Here's a cranial view of the bunny. And again, you would use the terms that, regardless of how the animal is positioned. So if I wanted to point out the medial surface of the right forelimb, I would be in this region, this region right here. Medial surface of the right forelimb. Remember, it's the animal's right or left. Other planes that might be described, here's one that will divide the animal into a top and a bottom or lower piece. So this is, there should be an N in there, NS, transverse. So this is a transverse plane. The alternate term that means the same thing is horizontal plane. So that means the same thing. So you can kind of think of it like the horizon, you know, here's the horizon in the background. Makes a top portion and a lower portion of that animal. And it could be anywhere. It's not just where that line happens to be. It could be down here. It could be up here. Here's a hummingbird, and again, we can use the D and the V are standing for dorsal and ventral. So anything that's on the back side of the animal would be dorsal. Even if you're talking about the wing, that's the dorsal side of the wing, which is, you know, more on the, here's the dorsal surface of his back. This is the dorsal surface of the wing, whereas ventral surface of the whole bird, ventral surface of the wing. Remember, proximal and distal, that's limbs. So in relation to the connection to the body, if it's further away than another part, we call that distal. This is a game that you can link, and you should be able to get to this from the notes that are along with this lecture video. Some terms for movement we've got in limbs. Just similar as if you take yoga or do exercise classes or whatever, you'll hear these terms, flexion, extension. So here's a horse, and remember this joint right here was the carpus, commonly called the knee, although it's not really a knee. But if the horse bends that joint and lifts the foot, as you see here, we call that flexion. When the leg comes back down into the straightened position, we term that extension, and it could be either forelimb or back limb. So, and that's just a term for describing movement of limbs. These two terms, AB or abduction and AD or adduction, refer to movement of the limbs either towards or away from that median plane or midline. So right down here, kind of a curvy plane there. So let's see if we can redo that. Right down here, that's better. So for the leg moving in the direction of the arrow away from the midline, we refer to that as an abductive or abduction, abductive movement or abduction. Whereas if it's coming in towards the midline, or maybe even a little across it, as we see here, that's adduction or adduction. And again, these are terms, you know, you might hear them in an exercise class somewhere. Here's another good link that you might want to go to play some games, look at some animations of anatomical terms and directional terms.